My dad chose his affair partner over me, so I let him live with that choice. He threw away his only son for a woman who promised him a better life. And when that life crumbled into dust, he came crawling back to the very foundation he helped demolish, only to find that I had rebuilt it without him. Hey everyone, before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. My name is Mason, and I am 28 years old. The memories of that Tuesday afternoon in late September are etched into my mind with the precision of a chisel on stone, cutting deep every time I allow myself to drift back to that moment. I was 12 years old, standing at the top of the staircase, my hand gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles turned white. I watched the scene unfold below in the living room, a silent spectator to the demolition of my childhood. The air in the house felt heavy, charged with a static that made the hair on my arm stand up. It wasn't just the shouting that had preceded the silence. It was the finality of the quiet that followed. My father, Richard, was moving with a frantic urgency, shoving clothes into a suitcase that looked far too small to hold the life he was leaving behind. He wasn't folding things. He was tearing them off hangers, a man possessed by a sudden, desperate need to escape. My mother sat on the beige velvet sofa, her posture slumped in a way that frightened me more than the screaming had. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at a spot on the carpet, perhaps tracing the pattern of the flowers woven into the fibers, dissociating from the reality that her husband of 15 years was walking out the door. I remember the sound of the zipper grinding shut, a harsh, jagged noise that seemed to signal the end of everything I knew. Richard looked up then, his eyes scanning the room, and for a split second, I thought he looked up the stairs. I thought he would see me, his son, his namesake, his flesh and blood, and realize the magnitude of what he was doing. But his eyes slid right past the landing, focusing instead on the front door, as if it were the gates of heaven waiting to open. He grabbed his suitcase and the leather jacket my mother had bought him for his birthday the month before. He paused for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob, and I held my breath, praying for an apology, for an explanation, for him to say it was all a terrible mistake. Instead, he pulled the door open and walked out into the crisp autumn air without a backward glance. The click of the latch engaging was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It wasn't just a door closing, it was a severance. Later, I would learn that he was leaving us for a woman named Veronica, a woman he had met at a conference 3 months prior, a woman who represented excitement and novelty, while we represented stability and routine. In that moment, as the taillights of his car faded down the street, I ceased to be his son in his eyes. I became merely a relic of a life he was desperate to shed, a piece of baggage he had decided was too heavy to carry into his new future. I stood there for what felt like hours, until the sun went down and the house grew dark, realizing that I was now the child of a broken home, a statistic in a society where promises were written in disappearing ink. The months following my father's departure were a blur of muffled sobs coming from my mother's bedroom and the deafening silence that inhabited the rest of the house. We moved out of the suburban home that held too many memories within a year, downsizing to a small apartment where the walls were thin and the privacy scarce. I learned quickly that grief was a lonely business, especially when the person grieving was trying to hold it together for the sake of a child. My mother threw herself into her work, taking double shifts at the hospital, trying to fill the financial void Richard had left behind with sweat and exhaustion. I became self-sufficient out of necessity, learning to cook my own dinners, iron my own school uniforms, and soothe my own nightmares. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. I stopped looking for his car in the pickup line at school. I built a wall around my heart, brick by brick, determined that he would never have the power to hurt me again. Meanwhile, through the grapevine of extended family and the occasional accidental glimpse on social media, I watched his new life flourish. It was a twisted form of torture, seeing him smile in pictures with Veronica, holding coffee cups on sunny beaches, living the life of a carefree bachelor who had shed his responsibilities like a heavy coat. A year after he left, the news came that they were expecting a child. I remember staring at the ultrasound photo a cousin had shown me, feeling a coldness spread through my veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. It wasn't just that he had moved on, it was that he was starting over, erasing us as if we were a rough draft in a book he had decided to rewrite. He was going to be the father to this new child that he couldn't be bothered to be for me. He would attend the Little League games, the Boy Scout meetings, the father-son dances. He would be present. When the baby was born, a boy they named Tyler, Richard paraded him around like a trophy. The contrast was stinging. I was navigating the turbulent waters of high school without a father figure to guide me, dealing with the awkwardness of puberty and the cruelty of peers alone, while he was buying designer baby clothes and planning extravagant vacations. My mother tried to shield me from it, to hide the updates, but the truth has a way of leaking in. I realized then that he hadn't just cheated on my mother. He had cheated on the very concept of family. He had traded his history for a future that looked shiny on the outside, but was built on the rubble of my childhood. I watched from the sidelines, a ghost in his past, while he played house with his new family. Every milestone I reached, graduating middle school, then high school, getting my first job, getting into college, I celebrated without him, his absence a prominent, hollow guest at the table. I learned that family wasn't defined by blood, but by who showed up when the lights went out. And Richard, for all his biological ties, had never really shown up at all. By the time I reached my 20s, I had successfully carved out a life that had absolutely no intersection with Richard's. I had graduated from university with a degree in civil engineering, a passion I had discovered in the quiet hours of the library where I used to hide from the world. I was living in a different city, building a career that required focus and dedication, channeling the anger of my adolescence into blueprints and structures that were stable, secure, and permanent. Everything my father was not. I had changed my phone number years ago and blocked him and Veronica on every platform imaginable. It was a survival mechanism, a way to stop the emotional bleeding. I wasn't bitter, or at least that's what I told myself. I was simply indifferent. Indifference was the armor I wore against the world. It allowed me to function without the constant weight of abandonment dragging me down. Occasionally, attempts at contact would slip through the cracks. A birthday card sent to my old address, forwarded by my mother with a note asking if I wanted it. An email from a random account that I immediately deleted without opening. He was trying to reach out, likely fueled by a sense of guilt or perhaps a societal expectation that sons should eventually forgive their fathers. But he didn't understand that forgiveness wasn't something he was entitled to just because time had passed. He thought that if he waited long enough, the dust would settle, and he could waltz back into my life as if he had just taken a long business trip. He didn't realize that in the years he was gone playing happy family with Veronica and Tyler, I had grown into a man who didn't need a father. I had learned to fix my own leaks, build my own roads, and weather my own storms. I had looked into the abyss of abandonment and decided that I would define my own worth. I dated occasionally, though I was cautious, always hyper-aware of the signs of infidelity or commitment issues. I knew my trauma had left scars, but I was working on them on my own terms. I had built a family of friends, colleagues who had become mentors, and a community that supported me. I was proud of the man I had become. I was strong, resilient, and fiercely independent. I wasn't the forgotten son anymore. I was Mason, the engineer, the friend, the survivor. And as long as I kept moving forward, I didn't have to look back at the wreckage he had left behind. I had effectively exiled him from my narrative, writing him out of the script of my life. He was a prologue, a dark and stormy beginning, but the rest of the book was mine to write, and he wasn't going to be a character in it anymore. The equilibrium I had built over a decade shifted on a rainy Tuesday evening, much like the one he had left on all those years ago. I was in my office, late as usual, finalizing designs for a new bridge project when my desk phone rang. It was an unusual number, local but unfamiliar. When I answered, a voice on the other end, a voice I hadn't heard in person but recognized immediately from the rare voicemails I used to delete, shook the foundation of my composure. It wasn't Richard. It was Veronica. She was sobbing, a cacophony of heaving breaths and jagged apologies that made absolutely no sense at first. I almost hung up. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to slam the receiver down and protect the peace I had curated. But something in the desperation of her tone froze my hand. She wasn't calling to gloat. She was calling because the shiny life she had stolen had corroded from the inside out. Between the gasping sobs, the story tumbled out. Richard had lost his job. It had happened 6 months ago, a corporate restructuring that left him redundant. He hadn't told anyone at first, trying to maintain the illusion of success, driving to the city every day and sitting in coffee shops or the library to avoid admitting the truth to Veronica. The stress of the deception had eroded the charm that had captivated her all those years ago. He had become bitter, angry, and withdrawn. The financial strain had been catastrophic. They had remortgaged the house, drained the savings, and were now facing foreclosure. The luxurious vacations had stopped. The designer clothes were sold. But the nail in the coffin for Veronica was the discovery of another affair. Richard, it seemed, hadn't just cheated on my mother with her. He had a pattern. When the stress became too much, when the perfect life he had constructed with Veronica started to fracture, he had sought comfort in the arms of yet another woman. The irony was suffocating. He had destroyed a loyal family for a fantasy, and when that fantasy became real work and real struggle, he destroyed it too, looking for the next easy exit. Veronica told me he had moved out 2 days ago. He had nowhere to go. He had burned bridges with his old friends, embarrassed by his failures, and his family, my grandparents, had passed away while he was busy playing house with his new wife. He was entirely alone. She gave me the number where he was staying, a cheap motel on the interstate, before hanging up, leaving me with a dial tone that echoed in the silent office. I sat there for a long time, staring at the rain streaking down the window of my high-rise. I thought I would feel vindicated. I thought I would feel a surge of dark joy at the news of his downfall, a poetic justice served cold. But the truth was, I didn't feel anything at all. It was like hearing about a storm in a distant country. It was tragic, but it wasn't my weather. The news didn't crack my armor. It just made the room feel a little colder. It took Richard 3 days to call me. I knew he would. When you have hit rock bottom, you look for the softest place to land. And in his mind, I was still the little boy who used to run to him when I scraped my knee. He probably assumed that blood was thicker than water, that the biological bond would override years of neglect. He was banking on the idea that I had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to need me so I could play the savior and prove my loyalty. When my cell phone rang, displaying the unknown caller that I knew instinctively was him, I let it go to voicemail. I needed to hear his voice first, to prepare myself for the manipulation I knew was coming. The message was pitiful. It started with a shaky hello, followed by a long pause. Then came the excuses, the sanitized version of the story Veronica had told me. He framed it as a series of unfortunate events, a bad economy, a misunderstanding with Veronica, who had become unreasonable, in his words. He never mentioned the other woman, the second affair. He painted himself as the victim of circumstance, a good man who had fallen on hard times. By the end of the 3-minute ramble, he got to the point. He was in a motel. He was out of money. He needed a place to stay for a few weeks just to get back on his feet. He said he missed me. He said he thought about me every day. He said he wanted to be a father to me now that he had the time. The audacity of it made me laugh out loud, a sharp, incredulous sound in the empty apartment. He wanted to be a father now that I was successful, stable, and independent, now that he had nothing else left. I agreed to meet him the next day, not because I intended to let him into my life, but because I needed to see him. I needed to look him in the eye and show him that the little boy he left was gone. I chose a neutral public place, a coffee shop in the middle of the city during the busiest hour of the morning. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who had once stood tall and confident, the man who wore authority like a cologne, looked shrunken. His hair was grayer, his clothes ill-fitting and wrinkled, and his eyes were darting around the room with a nervous energy I had never seen before. He looked old. He looked broken. He spotted me in the corner booth, and his face lit up with a tentative, fragile hope, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As he walked toward me, I felt a strange sense of detachment. It was like watching a movie actor playing a role of a down-on-his-luck dad. There was no pull on my chest, no urge to run into his arms. There was just the reality of a stranger approaching my table, carrying the weight of his own bad decisions. He sat down across from me, ordering a black coffee he couldn't afford, and immediately launched into a performance designed to break down my defenses. He started with the nostalgia, bringing up memories of when I was a child, moments I hadn't thought about in years. He talked about the time we went fishing and caught nothing, and the time he taught me to ride a bike without training wheels. He was trying to build a bridge with bricks of the past, assuming I still lived in those memories. He looked at me with watery eyes, his voice trembling as he told me how proud he was of the man I had become. He praised my career, my independence, everything he had no hand in creating. He was trying to claim ownership of my success, as if his genes were the only contribution that mattered. He spoke about Veronica with a thinly veiled disdain, painting her as the villain of his story, the one who had kicked him out when he was down. I let him talk. I sat there, sipping my black coffee, watching the theater of his desperation unfold. I saw the way he looked around the cafe, ensuring no one was listening to his sob story. I noticed the way he avoided eye contact when he glossed over the details of why he really lost his job and why his marriage ended. When he finally paused to take a breath, seemingly satisfied that he had laid the groundwork, he made his ask. He asked if he could stay with me. Just for a month, he promised. He would help around the house, he said. He could cook, he could fix things. He swore he had changed. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His hand was cold and clammy, and it took every ounce of self-control not to pull away in disgust. He squeezed my fingers, looking at me with a paternal intensity that felt like a physical weight. He said we were family. He said that in times of trouble, family was all you had. That was the moment the dam broke. Not a dam of tears, but a dam of silence. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw the truth. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was looking for a bailout. He was looking for a safety net to catch him because the one he built with Veronica had collapsed. He saw me not as a son he loved, but as a resource he could exploit. He viewed my home, my stability, and my income as a fail-safe for his own catastrophic failures. He had chosen to abandon me when I was a helpless child who needed him, and now he expected me to save him when he was a grown man who should have known better. The circular nature of his logic was stunning. He had taught me that actions have consequences, but he seemed to believe he was exempt from that universal rule. He thought that simply because he helped create me, he had unlimited access to the life I had built. He thought blood was a contract that signed over my life to his convenience whenever he saw fit. I gently pulled my hand out from under his, placing it on my lap. I watched his face fall slightly, the first crack in his confident expectation. I spoke then, my voice steady and low, cutting through the hum of the coffee shop. I told him that I remembered the day he left. I told him that I remembered the suitcase, the indifference, and the way he looked through me as if I were invisible. I told him about the years of silence, the milestones he missed, and the pain that eventually hardened into indifference. I told him that he had made his choice 16 years ago. He chose a fantasy over a reality. He chose himself over his family. And now, he had to live with the consequences of that choice. I explained that I wasn't being cruel. I was simply respecting the boundaries he had established. He had taught me that we don't get to pick and choose when we are fathers. You don't get to leave the game in the third quarter and then demand a trophy at the final buzzer. The look on his face was a mixture of shock and horror. It was clear he had never considered this possibility. He had assumed that my resentment was just a phase, a temporary storm that would pass with time. He didn't understand that his absence wasn't a gap. It was a foundation upon which I had built my life without him. He opened his mouth to argue, to plead, to use guilt as a weapon, bringing up my mother, his age, his health. But I stopped him. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. I told him that I wished him well, that I hoped he found his way, but that the way would not lead to my doorstep. I told him that I was happy, that I was whole, and that I owed that wholeness to the fact that he wasn't there to dismantle it. I left him sitting at that small round table, his coffee growing cold, his future as uncertain as the weather outside. Walking away, I expected to feel a surge of sadness, perhaps a pang of guilt for leaving my father destitute. But as I stepped out onto the busy street, surrounded by the noise and energy of the city, I felt nothing but lightness. The ghost that had haunted my hallways for years was finally laid to rest, not by reconciliation, but by truth. I had looked him in the eye and denied him the power to hurt me anymore. I had chosen myself, just as he had chosen himself all those years ago. The difference was, my choice didn't destroy anyone. It simply protected the peace I had fought so hard to find. I got into my car and started the engine, driving toward the life I had built with my own two hands. A life that was full, a life that was mine, and a life where the past remained exactly where it belonged, behind me. He had to live with his choice now, and for the first time, that was no longer my burden to carry.